All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and start today. Appreciate everybody joining on for this is our third session of the NBCEC Brown Bagger. We are delighted today to have a couple of speakers to continue our dialogue on current and future tools to improve genetic selection decisions. Dare Bullock is not the host today. Bob Weber is the host today. I'm Bob. I'm at Kansas State University and delighted to have you on board from here at K-State in Manhattan. I work closely with Dare and Matt Spangler to assemble the program and get all of our speakers lined up and logistics and stuff. And so, again, we're just delighted to have you. This is a lot of years doing this, and it's always a pleasure to get to bring some really interesting speakers to our audience. The first speaker today is, well, before I get to that, I guess, if you've not gone and checked out our website, the beef sire selection manual is available. Also, if you go to eBEEF.org, will be another location where the recorded sessions from this year's Brown Bagger series are hosted and available. So be sure to check that out. If you've missed some of the previous ones, we'll get those posted up a week or two after November sometime. We'll have all that material ready to roll. So as we move into our program for today, our first speaker in part one of session 3 under a session title of Trait Development Updates is Dr. André Garcia. André works at Angus Genetics Incorporated and is, for many of you, maybe a new face in our animal breeding and genetics community. So I'll give a little bit of introduction here on André. He's been a real pleasure to work with. He's spoken a couple of times at BIF meetings, and we're delighted to have him with us here today. André grew up in southern Brazil with an agricultural background that included both livestock and row crop production. In 2015, he graduated with a degree in animal science from Moringa, I hope I pronounced that right, Moringa State University, and completed a master's degree there in animal breeding and genetics as well. His master's research focused on carcass quality traits in a tilapia breeding program. So a breadth of experience in different species. Those of you, I'm sure, are all familiar with tilapia as a fish species. In 2017, he moved to the U.S. To continue his education and pursue a PhD in animal breeding and genetics, working at the University of Georgia with the animal breeding group there, and did a postdoc starting in the spring of 2020 there at UGA. During that postdoc, he worked on several research projects that had an emphasis in quantitative genetics applied to different species. Those of you familiar with UGA's program know they work in beef cattle, included the use of genomic information for genetic evaluation and the computational aspects around large-scale genetic evaluation. So trying to make those more efficient and productive was part of his work. In 2021, André joined the American Angus Association as a geneticist within the Angus Genetics Incorporated team that focused on research and development. And he also interfaces their information systems team to guarantee the quality and efficiency of the genetic evaluation services provided by AGI. Lastly here, André assists AGI and the association with educational efforts to help producers understand and utilize technology to improve those herds. And as part of that outreach effort, André's joined us today to tell us about a new trait that they're just completing development and rollout on sustained longevity in Angus cattle. And so, André, I will turn the remote control over to you. I do one housekeeping thing real quick. I just looked at my other screen here. For those of you joining as attendees, if you would, as you have questions, please go ahead and put those in the webinar chat or Q&A. I'll try and keep track of both of those as we move along here to be able to post those up. We'll questions, and then we'll have a Q&A with André and Ryan at the end as well. So please do, if you have a question, seize the moment, type it out, and we'll get those handled. So with that, André, I will pass, hopefully, if I can get remote control here to work. I'm going to mute myself and camera, so I'm going to go away, André, for just a second, but I'll be a voice away. If you need some help, I'll take control back. And
awesome, good deal. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, looks like we're good to go. Well, thank you, Bob, for that introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining here today. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk to this group about some of the developments we had, and so it's always good to share some of the stuff that we're doing here at the association. And so today in particular, we're going to talk about functional longevity, that research EPD that we've been working on in the past few years. And we're really excited about the developments we've made there too. Let me just make sure I can advance. There we go. So before we talk about, the modeling inheritabilities and getting to the weeds of that genetic evaluation, and I think this is not going to be new necessarily information to this group, but really we all know that cow longevity drives profitability. We all know we want a cow that stays in the herd and stays productive and turn out with the calf every single year. It's a very big driver of profitability in general. And of course, for the Angus breeders, this is no different. They've ranked this trait or fertility traits as a priority for research and development and for development of new tools. So it's been a priority for them and for the board of directors as well. And so we set out to do this research to be able to provide them with the tool to do selection in that area. The idea that we've set out to do, right, given those priorities to either improve the traits that we already have or the tools that we already have in programs, but also is to come up with new tools and help them with their selection decisions. Of course, when we're talking about that cow longevity or cow productivity, we're talking about targeting reproduction and fertility, improve that maternal function in general. We do have already some maternal tools or maternal EPDs. You could put the hyper-pregnancy EPD into that area, right? Selection for those maternal traits. I put some of the other maternal EPDs that we publish. You have their Cavanese maternal milk, mature weight. Although those traits are important as well, you might argue that they're not necessarily targeting fertility necessarily or reproductive performance directly. And so, of course, there is a need for more tools and improved tools on that area as well. As we get talking about fertility traits and reproduction, we all know that those traits are challenging. If you're in the animal breeding and genetics community, those traits, and if you put other examples as disease-resistant traits, for example, we all know that those are very challenging traits. There are a few reasons for this. The first one that we usually comes to mind is that fertility traits are lowly heritable. I put here heritability less than 0.2, but if we're being realistic, typically that really heritability is between 0.1 to 0.15 at best. And so lowly heritable traits, which make, doesn't mean the genetic progress is impossible, but it makes it a little slower and it takes a lot more effort to make selection progress. But so just pose some challenges. Typically those traits, we can categorize them maybe as sex limited traits. And because if you're talking about, okay, I'm measuring calves produced or how many calves a cow produces over her lifetime, we're only measure the cow side. We can also talk about bull fertility. That would be a whole different seminar, right? But those are typically a different set of traits. You can maybe look into semen quality traits. But again, typically sex-limited phenotypes, which means we can only record, roughly half of the population. So it makes it a little bit harder to, collect a good body of data. And speaking of collecting the data, it's difficult to obtain a complete set of data. And I say difficult because, of course, on top of all the traits that we already asked the breeders to measure, this is one more, but also it has to be measured for a longer period of time, right? So it's not, one birth weight or one weaning weight or one yearling weight. You have to record that cow basically every year that she's in the herd and kind of follow up on the records, right? Making sure, did she have a calf or not? If she didn't, why? And if she left the herd, why did she left the herd? So those things that are really relevant and important to develop a trait like this, they're difficult to keep track. So they really require good record keeping over time. And also another point here that's interesting is if you think about where, especially for the association, most of the data comes from the seed stock breeders. And if you think about genetic selection, typically those breeders are the ones that they want to push the generation interval and turn generations over faster, which means they're not necessarily keeping cows around for 10, 15 years to measure their performance over that long of a period of time. And so that makes it a little challenging too, because if we're trying to push the generations, we will cycle those cows maybe more often than they would allow us to capture data over a long period of time. Of course, we can talk about opportunities to capture data on commercial cow herds where they would like to keep those cows for as long as they are productive, right? And you could argue that a selection decision based on, longevity or cow productivity would benefit that part of the industry, since every extra calf is beneficial, right, for those producers. And so there are some other opportunities to capture data as well. But just to give, a few of the reasons why fertility traits are typically challenging. Again, doesn't mean that they are impossible, but we do have quite a bit of work to do as far as modeling and as well as data recording. Now that we have this context, I want to give you an overview of that functional longevity journey at the American Angus Association, some of the research that we've done and where we got to. And I would say recent research on this particular trait started around 2018, so even a little bit before I got here at the association. But I say recent research because many, many years ago, they also tried to come up with a longevity tool or a cow productivity tool for the breeders to be able to select on. But at the time, they recognized that the data available was not enough to be able to develop a genetic evaluation or to develop a tool like that. And so if you think about programs that the association have for the breeders today, right, for example, the AHIR and the Maternal Plus program, and more recently the inventory reporting, were set out in efforts to be able to collect the data on those cows and be able to have a more robust data set to be able to come up with the functional longevity or fertility related EPDs. And so this is why in the most recent years, right now, we have a big enough number of records that we can start working with and trying to define the trait. And in these most recent research efforts, we work with many different groups to pull this off. So I can put here the University of Guelph and Purdue University, as well as the University of Georgia, and of course our internal team here at AGI. Basically, this recent research, we focused a lot on data exploration. So, okay, what kind of data is there and how can we use it and explore it a little bit? Trait definition, this can also be challenging sometimes with this. I'm calling this this presentation, right, we're talking about functional longevity, but you might also have heard of stayability and different cow productivity, productive life, many different definitions. And also to investigate the modeling approach. So you can define the trait in different ways. You can also model it with different ways. And so, of course, there's different considerations for each of those approaches. And so a lot of the research time was spent in those three topics, right? Exploring the data, defining the trait, and come up with the statistical model to be able to calculate the evaluations. As we think about those tools and a little bit, to give you a little bit more details about the research projects that we've done, I'm not going to cover all the research that we did, but the first part of that was, okay, how can we define the trait? And so here the one of the definitions that we started working with was a definition that we call the traditional longevity. So that was basically looking at the cow data we had and then asking the question, was the cow in the herd or not? So every single year you could ask that question. So you come out with the binary phenotype, right? A yes or no, 1 or 0 or 1 response. That basically answers that question. Was the cow in the herd or not? Then another definition, here's the functional longevity, which goes a little bit further into that question. So did she stay in the herd and produce a calf? So the functional word behind longevity there, that's really the meaning, right? Because we're interested in cows that stay in the herd and produce a calf every year. This was also looking into a binary phenotype. Again, every year you can ask that question and then you get a yes or no answer for each of the cows in the data. As we look into our database, we do have some cooling codes that the producers can report. So when they go through the cows in their herd and they look, did she produce a calf? And if she not, and if she didn't, or if she left the herd for some reason, they have the opportunity to report that to us. And so that way we can use that information. And so in this initial work, we did some exploration on those cooling reasons and trying to separate it by traits or combine it all together to see if we could investigate what difference did it make, and if those cooling reasons, right, how can we make use of those cooling reasons since we have them. Again, for reference, I'm putting the 2 papers here that was published out of those research. Again, I don't mean to cover, it's just going to be the tip of the iceberg for the research that went into those 2 papers. But if you're interested, you can look into those for more details on the research that we did. I did want to cover a couple of things here. Again, like I mentioned, we tried to explore using those cooling reasons in different ways so that we could take advantage of the data that we had. And also another thing that we wanted to explore is, okay, we have breeders that report data and we have very good data reporters, right, that keep records from cows that are 2 years of age until they are 16, 17 years of age. And so we wanted to explore the age range a little bit as well to make sure, you know, what data do we need to use and can we truncate the data as we look into that evaluation. So here's, I have a table, and I apologize, it's a very crowded table, but I'll work through this a little bit. This first part, basically here you can see we use the data from all the ages, so from cows that were 2 years of age up to 15 years of age. And then here's what I'm talking about, those cooling reasons, breaking them down into basically 6 categories or 6 traits. So you had cooling reasons that were natural death, structural problems, disease, fertility, performance reasons, or miscellaneous, so kind of a group of reasons combined. And then there was also another trait where we combined everything together into one single trait, just instead of splitting by cooling reason, just use all the records as the same trait. Here you have the heritabilities basically for all this functional longevity definitions. So here you have the traditional longevity and 2 different models of the functional longevity. We don't need to go through all the heritabilities, but the main message here was, as we look across those, we do see that there is some variation, right, at least as far as the heritability goes, depending on how you use those cooling reasons. And so there's probably a benefit for us in collecting that data and developing ways that we can account for that information in our models too. As we look across the all data combined here at the bottom, you can see the heritabilities range from 0.09 to 0.13. Again, like I mentioned in the beginning, typically relatively low heritability for those fertility-related traits. At the bottom here, completing the table, you can see the information is very similar, but here instead, it was a scenario where we truncated the data. So we used data from animals that were 3 years of age up to 12. And you can see, if you look quickly over all the heritabilities, there is some variation on the heritability estimates. Overall, they tell a very similar story where you can see variability on the different cooling reasons versus overall. But there are some variations in the heritability from using all the data versus 3 to 12, but still very similar, telling the same story basically. Another way to look at this data, and I guess I forgot to mention, for those research projects, right, we've been testing that random regression model. And among other things, what the random regression model allow us to do is we can calculate heritabilities across a time period. And so this is what this graph represents here. Basically, if you look across the y-axis, this is the heritability. And then on the x-axis, we have the age span. Basically, so from 2 to 15 years of age, and you can plot basically the heritabilities at each of these time points. Each of these curves here would be one of those traits as defined before with the cooling reasons. If you look just at the solid line here in the middle, that's the all reasons combined into one trait. Basically, the pattern here that we can see emerge from this graph is you can see the heritabilities typically go up to age 6 and 7, and then plateaus for a little bit, and then it declines after ages 9 or 10, the heritability declines. Another pattern that you can pick up here, and I want to call your attention to the end of the graph, is that you can see that the heritabilities kind of fluctuate a little bit and they increase or decrease. And the reason for this is not necessarily that the heritability is changing in those later stages of life, but this is a function of the data structure because, oh, I skipped one too many slide. Because what happens was, yes, we do have some records, right, at those ages, but there are very few. And so when we go to estimate the variance components and the heritabilities, we get those fluctuations is because those estimates are just not very good. The standard errors are high. So as we think about what data should we really include in this evaluation or the heritability estimates, it makes sense for us to truncate that data a little bit just to avoid those fluctuations at the end. Again, like I mentioned, this is a very brief overview of that research. There's many more details and things that we can explore on those random regression models that was published on those research. But I wanted to focus here some time on that kind of road to implementation, which is after we've done a lot of that research, kind of the final phase of the research process really is to, get these to implementation so that we'll be able to provide a tool for our breeders. And this is what we've been focused here in the most recent time. So basically after that research and exploring that data a little bit, we stuck with the definition of functional longevity as I explained before, and basically using data from ages 2 through 10. And basically here, I mentioned on that research, we were looking into individuals that have the cooling codes so that we would be able to split the data into different traits and model them a little bit differently to investigate the variation across those reasons. But of course, for a genetic evaluation, we want to use as much data as possible, right? Our breeders spend a lot of time collecting the data. And so we want to make sure that we can incorporate as much data into those evaluations as we can. And so here we're looking into incorporating data from animals with and without the cooling reasons if they haven't recorded that. As we look into that implementation phase, like I mentioned, we've been using that a random regression model, considering the data from ages 2 to 10. And one of the differences here from that research project and now for the implementation is we're looking into a continuous phenotype. So instead of asking the question, did she have a calf every year, yes or no, we're counting the number of calves. So every year you can add one calf if she came out with a calf. And so basically that helps us a little bit in the implementation phase. As you guys will know, the continuous phenotypes have a lot of benefits from practical implementation compared to a binary phenotype. And so we're looking into that continuous phenotype for this functional longevity model. Now, this functional longevity research EPDs in the genetic evaluation, we include animals from the US and Canada. So it's a joint evaluation between the American Angus Association and the Canadian Angus Association. And I wanted to give you an overview of what data is in there. So basically, we're including data from close to 1.9 million cows, which amounts to about 8.2 million records. We're using, it's a genomic evaluation, so we're using all the genotypes that we have, which is about 1.4 million right now. And overall, we have close to 4 million animals in that pedigree. Now, as you can see here, because we're using data from ages 2 to 10, a cow can have up to 9 records for each of those cows. And we're using data from individuals born from 1990 and up to today. Now, Of course, as we talked about the research project and now trying to incorporate a little bit more data into the evaluation, we also went back and estimated some of the genetic parameters again. And so here is the graph that shows the heritability trajectory, which is very similar to the graph that I showed before from that paper. As you can see here, the heritability on the y-axis and the ages on the x-axis. The pattern is very similar. So we go in that first part, we see a slope with an incline in the heritability up to age 6. And then it plateau around 6 and 7, and then it declines from basically age 7 to age 10. As you can see here, the heritability is maximized around age 6, which is on the random regression model, right? That allows us to be able to understand, okay, where do we need to predict that EPD and where the heritability, where we're accounting for most of the genetic variance of the trait. And similar to what the previous research that we had done, around age 6 to 7, that's where the heritability is maximized. Another thing that we can do is we can look into the correlation between the breeding values across all those ages, or the genetic correlation between those ages outside of that random regression model. And what we found out is that if we look across the ages, the genetic correlation between the ages are really high after age 6. So this table here, I'm representing, if you look in the diagonal there, we have the heritabilities, and then the off diagonals, we have the genetic correlations. So as we look across this table, if you focus on age 6, you can see the correlations are very high between those ages after age 6. If you look into age 9 and 10, the correlation is 0.95 and 92, which is not super high, but still overall very high. So as you think about, one way to think about this is if you were to consider each of these ages as a separate trait, after age 6, you could assume that they are the same trait, right? There's very small re-ranking if you predict EPDs across those. So those things are important, right, as we look into that model to define where do we want to predict those EPDs, or how do you want to produce the EPDs after that random regression model. So those are indicators that help us make that decision. And so basically for that functional longevity research EPDs, we're predicting the EPD at age 6. And again, we're going to go through some of the reasons why, right? And of course here it's important to mention that even though we're publishing, or we're going to publish that research EPD at 6 years of age, we're still using all the data from 2 to 10. That's what the random regression model allows us to do. We incorporate the data, and then we can decide at which point of that trajectory we want to predict the EPDs. Age 6 is when the heritability is maximized, so it makes sense for a prediction to be at that age where most of the genetic variance is captured at that point. If you look at ages 6 through 10, the genetic correlations are very high, and so if you were to predict those EPDs from different ages, they would be highly correlated. I do want to say that the data from 7 to 10 is still relevant and is still important, especially as we think about the accuracy of individual EPDs. But we're going to predict that EPD at age 6. Also, we need to think about what makes sense from a production standpoint, and then think about the selection decisions that we're going to make, kind of what makes sense from that regard as we think about the selection process. As we look towards the kind of final steps of the research and looking forward to a release of that research EPD for functional longevity, there's a few things that we've been looking at, especially here in the last couple of months. That is, after the model is defined, the trait is defined, and we have all the genetic parameters, we can run the evaluation, look at the results, especially look into EPDs, accuracies, statistics, distributions, and things like that. And of course, as we go through that process, we can make adjustments to the data editing procedures, quality control, and model changes if we need. And why this process is important before we come out with the release of a research EPD is there's a few boxes we need to check, right? First of all, we need to be able to run it on time. You guys might know the random regression models are typically kind of complicated to run, especially with large data sets. So we need to make sure our running times are in check if we want to deliver a weekly genetic evaluation. We need to look into EPD stability. And what I mean by this is we all understand that as we add phenotypes and genotypes and progeny data, EPDs change. But on the macro level, overall, the genetic evaluation, if you look at the week-to-week correlations, we like to see a correlation that's higher than 0.99, which means the evaluation is stable. So that's also very important. as we look into data quality control and data editing procedures, right, as we go through and add more data week over week. So those are all relevant steps that we need to check, right, and make sure everything is stable and reliable. So that leads to a publication of a functional longevity research EPDs. Of course, we also look into the distributions of the EPDs and the accuracies week after week. So as we talk about that functional longevity EPD, as I mentioned, the phenotype here is the number of calves at the end of the day. And so when you think about the application, what is the unit of the EPD? The unit of the EPD is the number of calves by 6 years of age. And so as we look into communication and education to producers on how to use the tools, right, I came up with an example here. It's a very simplistic example, so don't laugh too hard, but I think it's helpful to understand how to use the tool. So let's say here I have two sires, right, sire A and sire B, and then sire A has a functional longevity EPD of 1.5. Sire B has an EPD of 0.5. So when I'm trying to make a selection decision, I'm trying to compare those two sires and decide which one should I use. And the difference between those two sires is 1, right? Very convenient, my example here. So that means on average, sire A's daughters are expected to produce 1 more calf by age 6 compared to sire B's daughters. So as we think about the selection goals and the breeding objectives, if my breeding goal is to increase the number of calves produced, a bull with a higher functional longevity EPD, right, would be desirable compared to a bull with a lower functional longevity EPD. So again, a very simple example, but I think it's important as we think about how we're going to use that tool and how it's going to be actually implemented in practice in the breeders' selection decisions. Another thing that before we wrap up, there's a couple of things that I want to make sure that I pointed out here. I think the complete data reporting is vital, especially as we went through this process and looking into the data and what we have and what we don't have. We want to emphasize this. And I think, of course, it's important to know when a cow has a calf. But you might argue that's even more important to know when she doesn't have a calf and kind of especially why she didn't have a calf. So all of those things, right, will help us further define a trait like functional longevity, but also be able to come up with new and better tools for those purposes. And so collecting a data like that will enable us to do future development on new tools. And that's why, of course, programs such as the AHIR and Maternal Plus, and for the Angus breeders, of course, the inventory reporting program is very relevant to collect this sort of data. So I put a note here where breeders will have the new inventory reporting, new window to report the data coming here pretty soon at November 1st. And so, again, just keep in mind that sort of information is very important for developing this type of tool. Another one that I think is relevant here too is that genetic improvement is cumulative. And I started off by saying, oh, fertility traits are hard, heritabilities are low, but I went on a good note, right? Genetic improvement is cumulative because as we look to these traits, right, fertility and some of those harder to measure traits, heritability is low and the initial spread in the EPDs might not be what we would like to see, right? But I do want to emphasize that if you continue to collect the data, measure the animals, and make consistent selection decisions over time, you will see the improvements in the population, right? So genetic improvement is for the long term. So you want to make sure we stay consistent, we use the tools, and stay consistent in the selection decisions to see the results over the longer period of times as the generations go by. As a recap and kind of things to look forward on the horizon, right? With this functional longevity research EPD, and I was talking to Bob before the presentation, this webinar is very timely because we are scheduled to release a functional longevity research EPD on October 25th, which is exactly a week from now. So we're very excited about that. We're very proud of all the work that has been done. And so looking forward to that. As we look into that, and especially for the Angus breeders, right, of course, being a research EPD, we'll be hearing feedback in the next several months and how are the tools being used, and especially as we collect more and more records, if we need to make changes or if we need to re-estimate model parameters or make changes to data edits, we can until we release a final production version of that EPD. Speaking of that, that kind of final production release is slated for next year, so 2024. Again, we'll be watching for feedback in the next several months, and as that research EPD reaches the breeders, we'll see what they have to say and make adjustments as we need, and hopefully we can release that production EPD by 2024. With that being said, of course, with the research EPD and later with the production EPD being released, we look forward to incorporating that EPD on our dollar value indexes, especially our maternal selection index. So it will add one more tool to our breeders' toolbox. With that, Bob, I'm happy to answer any questions if we have time. If not, I'm going to stick around for Ryan's presentation as well, and I'll be happy to discuss a little bit at the end. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andre. And we have maybe a minute here. We can take in the again, if you would either use the chat box or Q&A. I've got both those screen windows open here on my other machine, so I'm keeping track of all that. Andre, I might see one come up. One that always I think breeders are always interested in is, how do you form the contemporary groups for a trait like this? It's a lot different than a weaning weight or a yearling weight. The structure of who's in a contemporary.
Yeah, and that's, it's as we look into the data edits and things like that, right? That's a challenging one, especially because maybe for that first calf it's easy, right, to account for those effects because maybe everybody's calving together and life is easy. But then as the time progresses, right, maybe you're selling cows to different herds or things move around. And so definitely it's a little bit challenging. And so we have the contemporary groups that can capture some of that variation, but we also have some other effects, that can capture some of the variation as we go along, right? So we have to think a little bit more, the contemporary group will capture variation that maybe is in the first stages of life of that cow, right, as she was developed as a heifer. And then later on for the future calving seasons, right, we need to account for variation that happens and environmental effects that happen after that stage as well, and make sure we keep groups of calves together to account for those environmental effects for sure.
The duration of those cows and who actually was in the same environment, right?
Exactly. And I mean, in reality, right, the market is there, and so cows move around, and so that definitely creates some challenges. And as I talked about, data edits and data quality control, those are some of the steps that we took to make sure that we can account for those.
Yeah, super. Gabriel's first, and then Travis, nice to see you online, by the way, old friend. We'll leave yours to the next part because I think that is a really important question as well. But Gabriel's question is, did you analyze genetic correlation with other traits like weaning weight or maternal weaning weight?
So you cut off a little bit there. Can I answer those now, Bob, or you want to wait till the end?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thanks, Gabriel. Gabriel is a good friend too. So thank you for that question. So we haven't at this point. I mean, at that initial research, right, we treated that trait, breaking down by cooling codes and cooling reasons as different traits to investigate the variation a little bit. But that's the next stages of the research that we certainly want to do, is to investigate those correlations across traits. And as you know, feeding the random regression model, when you talk about estimating those variance components with multiple trait models, it gets a little challenging, but that's something that we're looking forward to investigate as we get this model rolled out as well, to investigate the correlations with other traits and the relationships there.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Andre, we'll appreciate if you'll stick around for a little bit. We'll get, I'm sure, some more questions as people, sort of digest and translate some of this information into their own context. Do appreciate your comments and congratulations. Right. Good. So with that, our next speaker is Mr. Ryan Boldt. Ryan is currently the lead geneticist for International Genetic Solutions, and he helps lead then the weekly multi-breed genetic evaluation at IG. Those breed partners. Prior to joining IGS, Ryan was director of breed improvement for the Red Angus Association of America. Ryan grew up in northern Colorado, attended Texas Tech University for his undergraduate, and then production traits. Currently, Ryan's finishing his doctoral studies in animal breeding and genetics, focusing on the use of commercial data to identify markers related to susceptibility to bovine respiratory disease. So, Ryan, we've had the opportunity to work together for some time. Really look forward to your comments. And I know we had an IGS call that I was on yesterday, and so talked a little bit about this and the exciting developments in dry matter intake. And so, Ryan, with that, I will mute and stop video. If you'll unmute, and then I'll give you remote control. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, Bob.
All right. And then if you need help, you just holler out, and I'll take the reins. So.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. Let me see here. Doesn't look, Bob, it doesn't look like I'm able to change slides, or the buttons on the bottom aren't showing up for me.
Click somewhere on the middle of the screen, it'll take control back, and then you can also, you should be able, once you've clicked on the screen, you should be able to use arrows too. So, but you found on this end. So.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Just had to give it a minute to catch up. So, like Bob said, I'm the lead geneticist for IGS, which is a partnership with 20 other breed associations, and we run a multi-breed genetic evaluation for numerous different traits on a weekly basis. And so, among other projects, one that I've been working on over the last, I guess, several months has been development of a dry matter intake EPD for the IGS genetic evaluation. And so that's what I'm going to visit with you guys. Today is a little bit of an update of where we're at in that process, and kind of what some of the tools will look like when we go to publishing that as part of the IGS genetic evaluation. And so, kind of just to begin here, I'd just like to give kind of a couple general comments about DMI data collection. I'm sure many of the folks here on this presentation have seen feed intake units, and have kind of seen how that data is accumulated. And so, in terms of DMI data, it's really a bit challenging, and it's really one of the rarest phenotypes that we have for genetic evaluation, for collection of those phenotypic records. And really, there's kind of a, potentially a multitude of reasons for that. One being that it's really been more recent that systems have been available to start capturing that data on large groups of animals. Just as importantly, generally those systems incorporate a lot of technology and are expensive and time consuming to manage and send animals through. And so it really starts to present challenges for getting wide swaths of data. And so as we look and kind of compare this data set to others that we have available for the genetic evaluation, it is by far the smallest in terms of phenotypic record. But one thing that DMI really does kind of have an advantage of is as we think about correlated traits or other traits that we can incorporate into the genetic evaluation to help us better estimate genetic differences for animals, is that DMI does have strong positive genetic correlations to growth traits, which are very commonly recorded, and so have the ability to incorporate that information into the analysis. And so, like I said, this graph here is a tornado graph or tornado plot. And you can see here on the left-hand side, I've got different phenotypes or different data really that we have available to the genetic evaluation. And then the width of the bar within this plot kind of gives us a representation of those counts and how much data we have available. And so it probably comes as no surprise that the pedigree is by far our biggest source of data within the genetic evaluation, followed by our growth traits, cavities, ultrasound, genotypes, carcass, and then this very small sliver down here at the bottom is a representation of the amount of DMI records. And so, like I said, one of the advantages is because we have so few phenotypes here available just by itself, we really have to look at correlated traits and incorporating other traits into the evaluation to help us get more spread in the EPDs. And so within the evaluation, we then kind of move up into our growth traits here, which have much more data and information in them. Another common question that I get asked in terms of multi-breed genetic evaluation is about breed representation and breed comparisons. And so kind of the way I put this together is this is a heat map essentially, or of counts of different breed composites or breed percentages of animals within the IGS genetic evaluation that also have data. And so the first couple columns here represent our more highly represented breeds. So that would be breeds like Angus, Simmental, Limousin, Red Angus. And then the final graph here represents a kind of a combination of our other smaller, more represented breeds. And so as you can see here from the graph on the side, as we go from white to red, it's an increase in the amount of animals or combinations from those different breeds in terms of animals that have DMI phenotypes. And we do have some and some comparisons that we have less data available for us to estimate. And so really, to me, that's probably more of a function of the just level of data recording. I think as more people start to record DMI, I think, we'll definitely see those numbers change and improve. As comparison, I also pulled this together for our growth traits as well. So similarly, the breed percentages here would be the same groups, but as you can see in the growth traits, we have many more comparisons. Here on the side, red would represent somewhere around 250,000 animals that would have representation with phenotypes as well as different breeds. So a lot in terms of our growth traits that we have available for making those different comparisons and making those breed difference estimates. which is vitally important in a multi-breed genetic evaluation. So as we kind of dive in here a little bit more in terms of data requirements, these are just kind of some general data checks or error checks that we apply to the DMI data coming into the evaluation. First being that obviously we want to know start and end dates of tests. We require that for estimating our age on test as well as our length of test. For the DMI evaluation, animals must be on test a minimum of 35 days to have that data incorporated. This kind of comes out of information or previous research studies that shows the relationship between shorter testing periods versus longer ones, and that we're able to get pretty good estimates of average daily dry matter intake on our shorter testing periods, which allows us to get more animals tested within a year. Age ranges for the DMI evaluation are between 240 and 545 days. That range is wider than what BIF recommendations would be, but due to the scarcity of the data, I think a lot of the data that we have currently came from research projects over time, and there are some older animals that were had DMI records, and for the time being, we wanted to keep that age range wide so that we can try to incorporate as much of that data as we can. Additionally, we will cull contemporary groups that consume more than 3% of their off-test body weight. And really what we're trying to look at there is records that are submitted as fed versus dry matter intake. And commonly, we have to have contemporary groups with more than one animal and have variation in the phenotypes. As we look to contemporary grouping information for each of the different traits, dry matter intake contemporary group would contain weaning information as well as on-test, start date, feed intake group. So this would be kind of a management parameter that would be submitted. So that may be things like test name, pen, things of that nature are wrapped up in that group, as well as the number of days on test. For the other traits that we're including in the evaluation, which is weaning weight and post-weaning gain, our contemporary groups are pretty standard for those. So similar are exactly the same as what IGS would be including for our growth and carcass analysis. As we look at kind of some of the effects that we're including in this genetic evaluation, it's going to be a three-trait model. For all of the different traits, we'll include the contemporary groups that I just went over, as well as breed covariates and outcross covariates. And then additionally for DMI, we'll also include an age on test linear covariate. There we go. As we look at some of the variance parameters that we're using in the evaluation, so we estimated these within the data sets that we had available. So our heritability for dry matter intake would be 0.26, and genetic correlations between weaning weight and post-weaning gain would be 0.51 and 0.63 respectively. So do see those stronger positive genetic correlations among those traits. As a result of that, obviously we'll have a dry matter intake EPD that'll be produced, and that'll be the difference in pounds of daily intake during the post-weaning period. And kind of to go back and just remind people that because we have high genetic correlations between DMI and growth traits, and the plan is to incorporate a lot of that growth information into the evaluations, we'll see pretty strong EPD correlations to to what we see with the growth traits. So that means generally we'll have, if an animal has higher growth EPDs, they'll also have higher DMI EPDs, as we would expect. The graph here I just put together, I just pulled out kind of a group of higher accuracy individuals. The x-axis here represents the yearling weight EPD, and the y-axis here represents the DMI EPD. So as you can see, just within this small subgroup of animals, very strong correlation among these EPDs. As a bit of a sanity check here, I also plotted the trend between those two EPDs. And so we see that the regression coefficient is about 0.02. Kind of as a bit of a sanity check on this, I also compared this to some of the commonly used feed equations for predicting differences in dry matter intake. And this regression coefficient almost exactly fits that from the NRC equations. And so it's a good bit of a sanity check to look at if the relationships we're seeing among the EPDs kind of helps us see similar as what NRC would have predicted. Additionally, have run a validation exercise on this data. So for this, we removed all the records of animals that were born after 2019, and then ran an analysis where where the EPDs were predicted for those animals without their phenotypes, and then correlated this to the animals' deviation from their contemporary group mean for these traits. So as we can see, that correlation to DMI is very strong and very strong at 0.47. As we look at the other growth traits that we're including in this analysis, those would be 0.4 essentially for weaning weight and about 0.33 for post-weaning gain. So seeing very good validation results as part of this kind of initially within this evaluation. The other portion of this evaluation that I've been looking at kind of more recently is a metric that would be more looking at kind of efficiency and really kind of a sub-economic index that includes the trade-offs between feed intake and gain during the post-weaning period. And so really this would be a pretty simple EPD or small sub-economic index that would really just look at some of those trade-offs. And so negatively weight feed intake and positively weight our average daily gain. Kind of in initial testing here, I've again got two graphs that x-axis on the graph on the left is the DMI EPD. In the graph on the right, it's the average daily gain EPD, and then both y-axes are this feed efficiency economic sub-index. And so again, this is just a group of high accuracy sires, and so we see kind of generally the trends are as the DMI EPD would decrease, we would see that efficiency sub-index decrease. As average daily gain increases, we see that increasing. So kind of makes sense as we think about those different drivers in the index. And so looking at kind of exploring a metric or this sub-index as a publishable EPD as well. So with that, I know we're kind of butting up against time here, so kind of went over that here pretty quickly, but I'll open the floor up for any questions about this. We are, I guess, kind of more generally working on kind of some of the fine tuning, I guess, of some of this evaluation, hoping to be able to have that released here in the near future. So. With that, Bob, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. And I'll also ask André to come back to us and thank you. Field a few of these questions here. Maybe we'll start, Ryan, since you just finished. Throw one at you. As you think about the sort of complexity of feed intake, particularly in a trait like, or with a trait like growth or average daily gain. When you put those together, I know there's some other breeds have done that exercise, and there's typically this overwhelming. I think you had your tornado graph. DMI is this tiny little sliver, and weaning weight's some big wedge, right? Mm-hmm. When we've incorporated the genomics data in there, does that kind of help us temper the imbalance of record count between those two traits? I know that historically has been a little bit of a challenge in analyses that didn't include the genomic stuff, but just sort of curious your experience there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think still with fitting correlations among the weight traits in DMI. I think we're still going to see some of that, and there's probably a trade-off, Bob, in terms of obviously we want feed intake records to represent the EPD, but we do have a challenge as we think about predicting a population and ultimately using those EPD and to estimate all of those animals, whether they have feed intake data or not, as accurately as we can, because that DMI in most terminal indexes kind of serves as the counterbalance, I'll say, to the growth. And so I think it's a bit of a trade-off. I think the individual marker effects for feed intake will help, but ultimately they're all very strongly related to one another. And so I think, we'll still run into some of those issues.
Yeah, the strong genetic correlation between DMI and ADG is a real double-edged sword. And it's pretty sharp, right? It's not a blanket.
Yeah. No, not at all.
Good. Well, thanks for that insight. Maybe we'll flip one over to André here real quick. Travis Taylor asks, have you seen a negative correlation with your fertility, longevity trait and carcass or milk EPD? Sorry, I got the wrong spot on the glasses, having trouble reading there. But between your functional longevity and carcass or milk.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it follows the same lines as Gabriel's questions, right? So at this point, we don't have those correlations yet. We're very anxious to look at those results too, for sure. And so that's on the next steps on the research to put those multiple trait models and start estimating some of those genetic correlations as we move along with this research EPD, for sure.
Yeah, super. Along those lines, André, one of the things I was thinking about, and I really do appreciate your comments about, the sort of the differences between sort of seed stock selection, right, and the tendency to turn generations faster than what our commercial customers might do. In kind of the amount of data we might collect. One of the things that occurred to me is, well, you've got a pretty sizable data set. And I would say for fertility traits, modest heritabilities. What's the spread in the best bull versus the worst bull? How much genetic spread do you see in the EPD for that trait?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, we have some of the preliminary results with the research EPDs. We're seeing over, if the unit of that trait is about the number of calves, right? So as you look into spread, it's around a little over one calf difference there, Bob. So as I mentioned before, and I've thought about this different ways, right? At some point you may say, well, that's not a very big spread, but at the same time, one extra calf, it could make an impact, right? So this is some of the preliminary results that we're seeing right now.
That's the high culling sort of period too, right? So the ones that make it through that, substantially better economically than those that don't. So I'm curious when you work through the calculations to include that in the maternal dollar indexes, calf production or live calves weaned. Yep, cool.
Okay, you cut off a little bit there, Bob. I don't know if you had an extra follow-up question to me or not. Just want to make sure I answered your question, and then if you had a follow-up or not.
Yeah, no, you did. I was just pointing out that the inclusion of that, even with just a one calf difference in selection index, is going to have a big economic impact in the index values.
Yeah, it could have, and that's as we move along with that production EPD, right, in the next few months, and as we try to model those inside the indexes, right, that's where we'll do some of the investigations on the indexes as well. Yep.
Yeah, great. Looks like maybe next question here back to Ryan. Says, what are some of the highest dry matter intake values you have seen with fall weaned stocker cattle on high quality pasture in the spring? So maybe a little outside the sort of test protocol. Maybe Ryan, explain just a little question here because it's outside the typical data collection you use for DMI, but describe the typical DMI record collection process to kind of help mop that up a little bit.
Yeah, Bob. So kind of, I guess the way DMI records are generally, and this will be an oversimplification, but generally there's some sort of system that has a bunk or a bin that feed is placed into it. And then animals usually have some sort of RFID type tags. And then once that animal essentially puts its head in, that the system will record the weight at the beginning of the beginning of that eating event. And then once the animal removes its head, it'll kind of take another weight. And then obviously that difference becomes what the animal consumed during that feeding event. And so it's always sitting there constantly measuring that and then calculates an average over the length of a test. So that test may be 42 days or 70. It kind of depends on what folks want to do and what kind of their goal is with measuring that intake.
Yeah, intake measurements complicated. There's a follow-on comment. I think a really important bit as we think about the feed efficiency trials per se is in feed intake systems, the precision of measurement of the feed intake component is actually quite high. The challenge is actually getting good body weight measurements and body gain measurements on a typical test and do a better job estimating that. And feed intake doesn't take a very long time to get a good estimate.
Yeah, Bob, I think you might have cut out on me.
Yeah,
you were asking me it.
Bad internet on K-State campus today, I'm afraid. Yeah, now I just get your internet connection is unstable.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, something's going on in Throckmorton. So my point was the challenge in feed efficiency testing is frequently not the precision of measurement of the animal intake or dry matter intake. It's body weight gain.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you've got another question you want to pose to these two gentlemen and scholars, if you would post those up, that'd be fantastic. Going one. Preparing your remarks for the session today. Really appreciate that. We will make these recordings available post-event. So for folks that may have missed previous recordings, you will have an opportunity to capture those or go back and listen to get a second take at it. I know that's something I frequently do is go, did I hear that right? And go back and listen. So those recordings will be available. 5th at noon Central for session number 4, our final session for the 2023 NBCEC Brown Bagger. That session title is Leveraging Sequence Data for Genetic Evaluation Systems. Be hosted by my colleague, Dr. Matt Spangler from the University of Nebraska. And a little bit of a mixture of speakers in that session. Troy Rowan, a new faculty member and maybe a new face to some of Knoxville in a beef genetics research and extension position, is going to provide a primer on low-pass sequencing and imputation for genetic evaluation. So for those of you that watch the trade literature, there's been some recent chatter about transitioning away from some of our current bead-based technologies or SNP technologies to sequence data and using sequence differ from the current data we get, and how might we do a better job incorporating that in our genetic evaluation systems, and what implications does it have to both seed stock and commercial producers. So Troy is going to give us some background information there. For those of you that might have attended BIF, you'll get another taste of a talk that he gave. Part of this was part of a topic he gave at BIF. Really good material, and look forward to Troy's comments. Speakers are actually new geneticist spotlight. So we've had a couple of new teammates in our breeding and genetics space in beef cattle join faculty appointments. So Dr. Jamie Corder is now at the University of Missouri, and so she'll give a little background and introduction of herself as well. Has taken a faculty position at Iowa State University. And so she'll provide a little bit of background and direction of her research and extension programs there at Iowa State. We'll wrap up the session with the traditional BIF invite. So an invitation for the Beef Improvement Federation's annual symposium to be held next June. Next week, and in the meantime, have safe travels if you're out and about, and have a wonderful weekend. Look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you all.